welcome back. I got a promo email from Pulsar the other day announcing the release of their 1178 compressor, and the interface looked so good I had to give it a try. Lots of other people are reviewing it, so I'll just say it sounds great, and the extra features like Sidechain EQ and MS compression are really useful. What really piqued my curiosity was the sidechain delay feature, hidden away behind the EQ section. If I turn this up, I can delay the sidechain signal and make the compressor react too late, and miss the start of the transient. Carefully balancing the delay time and the attack speed can create powerfully aggressive transients as they sneak past, and then the compressor slams down behind them. It's not something I would do every day, but it's definitely a useful trick when you need it. A side note, there's a funny thing I've noticed about the way we describe compressors. Fast attack times are described as aggressive, while slower attack times are described as gentle. But of course, that's not necessarily the effect it will have on the sound. In fact, there's a range of attack time settings that will give you an aggressive, punchy or snappy sound. And if you go faster than that, you'll kill the transients completely, and the sound will probably get softer and less aggressive. Anyway, delaying the sidechain results in a certain type of slowness to react, which can sound very aggressive indeed. But notice the slider can also go the other way if you tell the plugin you're okay with the inevitable latency. Applying a negative delay to the sidechain means the compressor will now react a bit too early. The fastest attack of a FET-style compressor like this, which already verges on completely eating the transients, can become even faster and finish the job. Normally, of course, the tight and snappy attack is half the reason you would want to use a FET compressor in the first place. So this is what I mean by the least exciting feature. Literally, it removes the exciting transient enhancement and just leaves the release stage to shape the sound. Lookahead, or negative sidechain delay, is something I don't often use myself. The only thing I regularly use it for is my voiceovers, as I want the compression to be as transparent as possible in that case. But it's still useful to know what exactly does a lookahead function do. Is it simply a negative delay? And is it the same in every compressor that offers it? Let's start by having a little think about what we would want from a lookahead feature. Here's a snare drum sample, and let's draw in some automation to represent how a compressor might react to it. With no lookahead, the first automation point needs to be where the signal crosses the threshold. Let's say that's here. Then the gain drops in response to the peak, then releases back up to unity again. Of course, the attack and release stages are unlikely to be linear like this. Let's make them a bit curvier and more realistic. The attack time will now set the position of the second automation point. With a slower attack, the gain won't be able to change as quickly. But the compressor will still start to release when the input level starts to drop, so there'll be less gain reduction. And the leading edge of the transient will be shaped and enhanced. Let's say you don't want that, however. You want to catch and kill the transient completely. On most compressors, the fastest attack setting won't do that. Sometimes it nearly gets there, though, so you just need to deal with a tiny little spike at the very start. Let's dial in some lookahead then. Or more accurately, negative delay for the sidechain, so the gain reduction all moves a little bit earlier. And that might be enough to do the job. Maybe you'll also want to slow down the attack a touch to reduce the amount of distortion. Of course, this has also moved the release stage a bit earlier. Perhaps not enough to matter much in this case. But what happens if we take it further? It won't take that much to basically just break the compression. Now the compressor clamps down uselessly in the silence before the hit, and is already well into the release stage when the actual transient arrives. I can't imagine a setting like this being useful for anything. Anyway, the point is, if the lookahead feature literally just delays the audio signal relative to the sidechain, you're going to have to be very careful when setting it. Any delay you add needs to be just enough to allow the compressor to catch the peaks it was missing, and no more. And if you want the compressor to catch those peaks but with a slower and gentler attack, you're going to have to dial back the attack manually and balance that setting against the delay. But there's another way that a lookahead feature could work that would make life a lot easier. Let's go back to our fastest possible setting. Now imagine that when you dial in the lookahead, you don't change anything at all about the release stage. The compressor still knows where the peak is. It doesn't think it comes earlier. But the gain starts to drop in advance of the transient, so you catch the very start that was previously squeaking through. And you also slow down the attack to reduce distortion. In this scenario, only the attack of the compressor changes when you add lookahead. You won't break the release stage or start to miss the peaks if you add too much. You don't need to be too careful about how much you dial in, and you don't need to adjust anything else to compensate. So, how do our compressors actually handle lookahead? Let's find out. I've created a little JS plugin for the purpose of this test, which just generates a constant DC offset. While I'm fairly sure my DA converters will block DC, I've got no intention of testing that. So the routing is turned off for the channel to stop this signal actually going anywhere. Now I'll load a compressor. Is anyone surprised to see me reach for the fab filter? I know you all think I'm just a shill, but I promise you I haven't discussed the videos on my channel with the fab filter guys at all. And as far as I'm aware, they haven't even seen them. Anyway, let's start with no lookahead and feed the sidechain from our snare drum sample. Now I can render the track and get a nice graph of the gain reduction. No surprises here. The gain dips until we reach the maximum peak level of the sample, then rides back up as the compressor releases. Now let's try it with the maximum 20 milliseconds of lookahead. And that is interesting. The release doesn't seem to have changed at all. The compressor still knows where the maximum peak is and still applies the maximum gain reduction at that point, but the gain simply starts to ramp down before the start of the sample. To really press home the point, I'm going to pop both these tracks into a folder and flip the polarity for one of them and render the result to get a null test. As we can see, there's no difference after the peak. The lookahead has only affected the attack stage before it. Don't ask me how they achieve this. Some kind of clever filtering, probably. Incidentally, here's a little insight that may not have occurred to you. The attack and release smoothing of a compressor is basically just low-pass filtering. You take a signal with sharp, jagged edges and smooth off the corners to make them curvier. That's a low-pass filter. So if you ever wondered why people that are great at designing filters are sometimes also great at designing compressors, well, it's perhaps not entirely a coincidence. Okay, let's try a different compressor. Here's UHE Presswork. And this time we have a control labelled Sidechain Delay rather than lookahead, which suggests it's just going to shift the gain reduction a bit earlier when I turn it down. Let's find out. Here's what we get with 0 delay, and here with the maximum negative 5 milliseconds of delay. Or is that the minimum? Anyway, the result is quite different. There's no softening of the attack as there was in the FabFilter plugin. It seems to have just moved a bit earlier. So it's just a simple delay, right? Well, not so fast. Let's check the release. Honestly, it's hard to tell if it's moved just by eyeballing it, so let's try the null test again. And this tells us that no, it hasn't. Whatever the parameter name says, this isn't just a negative sidechain delay, as the release stage apparently isn't affected. Funnily enough, Recomp, with its crazy parameter ranges, provides a clue as to how this might be achieved. Amazingly, I have an hour of content on my channel specifically talking about Recomp, and I don't think I mentioned the precomp parameter at all. But of course, I was chasing analog-style compressor sounds, and analog compressors don't normally have lookahead. So here's what Recomp does with no precomp, and here's what happens with 20 milliseconds. Like the UHE plugin, the attack stage moves earlier without being softened at all, and the release stage doesn't move. Here's where it gets interesting. Let's try again, but with the precomp maxed out at 250 milliseconds. And suddenly it makes sense. The compression is still triggered by the original undelayed sidechain, as well as the one that's shifted earlier. Presumably we now have two envelope followers, one keyed from the earlier sidechain signal, and the other from the original undelayed signal, and the compression is triggered by whichever is greater. That means that with more sensible settings like 20 milliseconds, the attack portion will be dominated by the earlier sidechain signal, but the original non-time-shifted sidechain will take over for the release stage. We do need to manually slow down the attack, unlike with the FabFilter plugin. But we don't need to worry about breaking the release or missing the peak. That's taken care of. All you need to worry about in Recomp is avoiding those crazy long settings, which are unlikely to do anything useful in most cases. Usually just a few milliseconds is plenty. Likewise, the Pulsar plugin we started with. I can't use the same test this time, as the 1178 plugin blocks DC, as we can see here in Plugin Doctor. But we can do a similar test with the Doctor. Here we see what happens when a sine wave suddenly gets louder and then quieter again. When I dial in some negative delay, the gain reduction just moves earlier. It doesn't get any gentler. But the release doesn't move, so it seems to be doing the same kind of trickery as Recomp and Presswork. And of course, this time we have a more sensible parameter range, so you can't set the delay long enough to stop it working as intended. So the reality of Compressor Lookahead is, no, they're not all the same. But they seem to fit into two camps. The Recomp, Presswork, 1178 approach shifts the whole attack stage earlier, so you'll need to manually soften the attack. While the FabFilter approach just shifts the start of the attack stage and softens the attack for you. Neither approach will affect the release stage or break the compression, unless you go crazy with the setting in Recomp, in which case all bets are off. If you wondered why, of all the features on offer in Pulsar's plugin, I chose to focus on the least exciting one. Well, as nice as it is to have mid-side functionality built in, it's not difficult to set this up manually with MS Matrix plugins and separate instances of the compressor. You can do this with any compressor plugin if you want to, so having it built in really just adds convenience. Likewise, the Sidechain EQ. It's a very well-designed EQ, and it's nice to have it there. But any compressor with a sidechain input can do the same thing if you use a separate EQ plugin. Even if it doesn't have a sidechain input, you can use emphasis and de-emphasis tricks to achieve the same effect, as I show in this old video here. The saturation. It sounds great, and granted, a different saturation effect won't sound the same. But nevertheless, there's nothing to stop you loading any saturation plugin before or after the compressor. Lookahead is different. As we've seen, no compressor design seems to implement this as a simple negative delay for the sidechain. Not even Recomp. Not even Presswork, which actually calls the parameter just sidechain delay. So you can't recreate it manually with a sidechain input and a delay plugin. At least I can't think of any way. If it's not built into the plugin, it's not going to happen. Making this video made me realise how few of my compressor plugins offer any kind of lookahead at all, and even fewer that implement the approach we see in the FabFilter compressor. In fact, it seems that the only other compressor I've got that does lookahead in a similar way is a freebie. This is FirComp, or you might want to call it FIRComp if you have any DSP knowledge. Notice that the attack does actually go to 0, like Recomp, and does successfully stamp on the leading edge of the sine wave without leaving any little spikes behind. Let's zoom in on the attack portion. Now notice what happens if I turn on the lookahead feature, which is just an on or off option in this plugin. Now the gain starts to ramp down just before the leading edge of the sine wave, and the compressor can catch transients without having to brutally clip them. According to the plugin blurb, this is achieved by use of FIR filtering, hence the name, I suppose. Interesting that the plugin was named after its least exciting feature. Anyway, I mentioned my previous hour-long coverage of Recomp already, and if you've sat through all that, you've probably got the correct impression that I'm rather fond of the plugin and its little quirks. However, I have to say, I think it rather misses the mark as a stock compressor. Let me explain. The stock compressor is the one you use when you're in a hurry. Maybe you're in the middle of a session and under pressure. That vocal really needs a compressor on it. But you also need to place mics, sort out headphones mixes, and so on. Maybe you're in a studio you haven't worked in before. They don't have any of your go-to plugins. You don't recognize any of the stuff they do have. That's when you need a stock compressor. The last thing you need in that scenario is crazy parameter ranges that go from full-on distortion to no compression at all because it's so ridiculously slow. What you need is the bare minimum of essential compressor controls: threshold, ratio, attack, release, makeup gain. No more, no less. If there's a switch for a sidechain filter, that's fair enough. Maybe a soft or hard knee option. I don't want any more than that. Likewise, the parameter ranges are critical. I want enough control to be able to shape the sound meaningfully, but strictly within normal operating limits. Otherwise it's just harder and more fiddly to find the settings you need. And the compressor behaviour is also important. It should be moderately program dependent, so you don't need to be so precise about your settings, and it's generally fairly forgiving. But you should still have meaningful and predictable control of attack and release, so you can make things snappy or pumpy when needed. When I made the recomp videos, I wanted to recommend a free alternative that I thought could tick all those boxes as a stock compressor replacement, but I couldn't find one. But if I ignore the lookahead feature that the plugin is named after, Furcomp comes pretty close. This might be the best compressor when you're in a hurry. And it might in future be my recommendation for best beginner's compressor plugin. Unfortunately, it lacks the key criteria for a stock plugin, which is that it's pre-installed and integrated with the DAW and always available. In my opinion, Recomp should be the tweaky compressor option in Reaper rather than the only one. It would be great to have a simpler bread and butter option as well, and if the devs decide to do that, they could perhaps take some inspiration from FIRComp. Someone actually tipped me off about this compressor, but now I can't remember who it was. If you're watching, please take credit in the comments so I can thank you. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks for watching.